In the 26th letter, explaining the Zohar, the teachings of the Zohar, that as we explained in yesterday's class, the true understanding, the faulty understanding is that Torah would be divided by mystical and the do's and the don'ts, and that the mystical part of Torah teachings is an expression of the tree of life, but the do's and the don'ts and all the arguments that and the logic that make up the Talmudic reasoning is part of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So yesterday we explained that in fact the essence of Torah is of course all holy, the tree of life. It is, excuse me, an expression of divine wisdom. But divine wisdom does not mean that it cannot be concealed. That's where we're going to go now. So Torah study inherently is, as we're doing now, this is mystical teaching, so it's more open and more clear, the divine nature, as opposed to when you are, any of you have studied Talmud, grappling over and splitting a hair in argument back and forth that sometimes could feel that, it's not, you don't feel the holy connection. It is, though, because essentially it is. However, why is there that argument back and forth? Why are people, Jews, people, as we say, 2 Jews, 3 opinions? Where does that come from? It comes from what our purpose is, as we will understand. Now, we understand that, and we've learned this at great length, that when you have a physical object in this world, and by using it towards God for a mitzvah, you refine that physical object and it becomes elevated and it becomes what we call making a dwelling place for God in this low world. The lowest thing in this world is the physicality of this world, and is through our actions is the lowest thing, the lowest meaning in the simplest thing that a human being does. Speech is a lot more engaged and involved and more complicated than an action, like, stretch your hand out, right? A little baby can stretch their hands and they play with their hands, right? They can do that. They can crawl at a certain point, toddlers, but, or walk better, as toddlers, but they can't speak yet. Why? Because it's a little more sophisticated capability to do that. They can't think, methodically. It's even more sophisticated intelligence. Meaning that action is the lowest thing. Not lowest in value, but lowest in quality of capability of an individual. Hence, making a dwelling place for God in this low world through your actions. Well, what's your actions? Your actions don't engage intelligence, right? Action is the mind. Action is engaging a physical thing in this world, right? Taking, a hide of leather and making it into tefillin or a mezuzah and making a mitzvah from that. In other words, what you're doing is refining the physical world and elevating it. Well, that refinement started off and originally, way back, in the evolution of things. And yes, we believe in evolution, not Darwinism. That's not what Torah believes in. We believe in evolution from the spiritual to the physical. And it doesn't have to take too long. God is almighty and he could do it very quickly. But there is an evolutionary process from the spiritual. So what happened in the world of the spiritual, there was something that was called Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. In the world of spirituality, in the worlds, There was, at one point, the light was so great that it broke the vessels. As we've explained, that in the divine attributes, they are made, spheres are made up of light and vessels, similar to what we're made up of. But we don't call it light and vessels, we call it body and soul. So in the spiritual realm, it's called light and vessel, body and soul, if you will. And there was the soul aspect, the light aspect was too great, and it shattered the vessel. And the vessel shattered into 288 sparks. Those sparks fell into this world in a concealed way, not an open, revealed way. And what we are doing is refining this world by taking those sparks that fell into the physical and elevating them every time we do a mitzvah with something that has a spark. You know, bacon for a Jew, eating it doesn't have a spark that can be elevated. But eggs do. You know, eggs are kosher. And they do. So they can be elevated. So they can be elevated during the week because we use that energy to serve God. On Shabbos because we're having the pleasure of those eggs or cholent or challah. And because it's a mitzvah to have pleasure on Shabbos, physical pleasure of enjoyment. So that's in the physical realm, and that's a concept that we're very familiar with because we've learned this many, many times over. But in this, the Alter Rebbe is speaking about that there's also the same idea of the sparks that fell into the physical. They also fell into a spiritual realm, into the abstract realm, into the realm of divine wisdom. The divine wisdom fell into, excuse me, also the sparks into klipa. Just as in the physical it fell into klipa and klipa, an admixture of good and evil, right? Eggs are an admixture of good and evil, right? I had here at Chabad Zichron today, our chef. Oops. Sorry, 1 second. Hello? Come in. Come in. Sorry. Our chef, Caesar, didn't make a Caesar salad, but he made really good eggs. Now, so those eggs are an admixture of good and evil. What could be evil about eggs? Well, if you pick out an eggs and the energy you're getting from it is a negative energy. It's not to blame the eggs, but it's the reality of the eggs. Eggs do not exude divinity. They have a spark of divinity in there, depending how we use those eggs. Will depend if we take out, extract, disencumber it from the physical numbing of divine energy. And when we use it in an appropriate way, then we disencumber it and we elevate and refine it and elevate it to a holy source. So that's in the physical, and that's a very fundamental idea in Tanya. But here we're speaking about it in the spiritual realm, excuse me, meaning in the divine wisdom. So divine wisdom comes from Chokhmah, divine Chokhmah, wisdom. That's where Torah comes from. However, a concept that we learned earlier, that the father begets the daughter, the mother begets the son. We'll go into the finer details in that, what that means. What that means, Chachma begets Malchus, which is the daughter, feminine aspect. And what that means is that the divine wisdom is enclosed, begets and enclosed the Malchus, which Malchus is divine royalty, sovereignty, the king. The king rules with speech, and that is the reference of the divinity of, or the wisdom of the divine wisdom is now expressed in the oral Torah. In the oral Torah, which Malchus is oral, right? The word of the king, the word of God. The word of God being the Torah. Now, Malchus in turn, it then clothes itself into the various worlds. And on one aspect, it clothes itself. And what does it do? It creates. The word of God creates. God said, let there be light. Right? So it's the creative power. In that creative power is the divine wisdom clothed in there. The divine wisdom of Torah. But through the creative process, it now gets hidden in that creative process. And that spark gets hidden. Folks, give me one moment. You're here early, and I'm teaching online right now. So I just wanted to make sure that we're the. I know, so you'll have to wait till I finish. That's fine. About 10 minutes or so. That's fine. Okay? I'll be upstairs. Okay. My apologies. Someone came a bit early. So, so now, through this process, through this process of the creative process, what happened to Torah teachings, even though essentially they come from Atzilus, which is perfectly divine, one with God, but as it comes into the worlds, and spiritual worlds, and ultimately into the physical world, it becomes encumbered. It becomes encumbered, meaning in Klippa. Now, how could Torah teachings become encumbered in Klippa? What does that mean exactly? What it means is very simple, and here we get the idea why there's arguments in Jewish teachings. Because what's happening is the wisdom of God, to apply it to something new, right, is, well, actually, let's leave the new for a moment. To understand it, you got to break your head. To understand the arguments back and forth. It's not like it's clear, you know. You need to you need to break your head, so to speak. And to adjudicate a law, so through the arguments back and forth, and to now come up with the law, so you need to disencumber. I had yesterday someone who reached out to me about a kosher question. So there wasn't clarity for her. It was encumbered, right? So I had to ask a few questions to disencumber. By asking those questions, you know, got a clarity on the situation and was able to adjudicate the law. The point is, okay, that was maybe a simple thing that was, you know, just needed to clarification of the facts. But sometimes it's not just a clarification of the facts. Sometimes it's the clarification that we need to make of the law itself, which is an interesting idea. You know, people think that Judaism is, you know, it's carved in stone. 10 Commandments were carved in stone. Well, that's true. But Torah is eternal. Its message is eternal, and the adjudication of the law is eternal in the sense that there's always variations of a law. There's always a new, a new variable that's thrown into the mix. So it's not so clear. There could be, when you're adjudicating a law, there could be 10 principles that you need to deal with. And which one weighs more than another? Well, in one circumstance, it might be A. In another circumstance, it might be B that weighs more in weightiness of adjudicating the law. All that means that there isn't a clarity. Well, how come? Because that's what we're here for. Just like we're here in the physical to bring a clarity to the physical world by using it for a higher purpose. So likewise, in Torah wisdom, there's also a klipa, a shell that covers over, and therefore the holiness isn't there, and that means that there isn't a clear connection and clear understanding. And you have to, break your head, so to speak, to understand well, in order that you can ultimately, what can you do? You can elevate that spark that's there, that's encumbered, and we elevate it through the teachings. And with this, the Alter Rebbe explains that the Zohar, when it said that the sages, that they studied the law of permissible, non-permissible, because they were helped by ignorant Jews who didn't know the law necessarily appropriately, and maybe didn't keep the things appropriately for them in sustaining them, and that's why they studied to know that that's how you might think. No, that's not why they learned. They learned these laws because the spark of divine wisdom is concealed, and it needs to be disencumbered, to be sifted out, be refined and elevated, so you can, and that will go with a lot of deliberation, a lot of arguments back and forth on the issues. And therefore, Jews argue a lot. Now, a real argument is not for the sake of the argument, it's the sake for finding the truth. What is the truth? Right? That's the true argument, not like that I could be right, or no, it's and that's the difference between a true Torah scholar and sage and others who have an agenda, other movements that have an agenda, because they just they are not following Torah dictates, even though they might be studying Torah and might be basing some of their adjudication or conclusions on Torah, but in fact it's not. Because here it's about finding the truth, what Torah says, not, what I would like to have as a conclusion, and I'll try to figure it out, how the Torah says that, because you can find anything that you want when that's what you want. So that's a parenthetical remark. So therefore, in that respect, there's part of Torah teachings that are, in fact, in the klipa's noiga, the shell of noiga, which is an admixture of good and evil, that needs to be cracked open. By cracking your head open, or really engaging yourself in the teachings, in order that they should be, again, sift out the truth, which is that godly spark. And that's why it's called good, in order that it is elevated and brought to its holy place. And that's what the sages are always doing. Because right now, since the two things. So we have, as we explained, the breaking of the vessels in the spiritual realm. Then that came in creation with Adam and Eve. That was further admixture created by them eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Then what was the result of that? Now there is nothing in the world that is not good and has some evil in it. There's nothing in the world that isn't some evil in it and has some good in it. That's the world became. And that was the natural condition of the world. And that's why they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, because now they created a new condition. In the Garden of Eden, everything was holy, everything was good, except for one tree that had a mixture of good and evil. The tree of, right, that one tree. And the serpent, who was the embodiment of complete evil. But they were very defined. Now it's not very defined. So much so we could get confused. We could think that, we call some kind of person who wraps themselves up with explosives and kills innocent people, we could call them freedom fighters. That's how confused people are. That was an unpaid political statement. But yeah, I think you get the drift. That's what kind of world we live in. Further was when the Jewish people went into exile. Then really the spark of God, holiness, the Shekhinah, as we call it, divine presence, which is Malchus, there's Malchus again, right? Went into exile. As the Jewish people went into exile, it says God went into exile. What does it mean? God, the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God went into exile. And what are we doing? We're sifting through of all that is a admixture of good and evil, in order that we can elevate all of that spark of holiness that's there. And as we're learning here specifically, that's what Torah, the mitzvahs are in the physical as a result of that. But here we're understanding that this is the idea of divine wisdom, not just the physical things that we kind of get. But here we're going, it's a step more. Torah teachings itself, God's divine wisdom that's one with Him. Yeah, essentially it's one, absolutely. However, it fell just as the sparks fell. In the physical, they also fell in spiritual dimension of divine wisdom that's now in Klippa, that needs to be disencumbered, refined, and elevated. And that's the story for today's Tanya. All right, I hope that was clear. Folks, was it clear? You lost the broadcast, Diane? Oh no, I hope no one else did. I hope you regained it. Rena, Boker Tov to you in Colorado. Ita, welcome. And Shavua Tov, Pablo. Shalom. Darren, does engaging physical object in this world and elevating it include the use of our physical body to perform a mitzvah? Absolutely. Yes, Darren. Our physical body that's engaged in the mitzvah, right? When you stretch out your arm to give charity, your arm is elevated and bound up with God and is elevated. Because an arm is just an arm, but it's getting vitality from God's holiness. Erica from Norway, hello. Karen from Ohio, Boker Tov. Valerie, Missouri, hello. Evelyn, shalom. Is Kavanah intent necessary to liberate the sparks of divinity? Absolutely. That is the ultimate, intent. Is that through this act, this is what you're doing, right? Okay. Oh. All right, Valerie, enjoy it later. Yes, Valerie, yes. Margot, thank you. Leora, very clear. Okay, wonderful. Well, the broadcast was interrupted again. This is the second time. I'm very sorry. I don't know what's going on. If anybody knows. Actually, I want to thank Jeff for yesterday helping with the class that we did have a disruption. Okay, where was the interruption? If you can let me know, that would be great. Was it at the end, somewhere else? And how long was the disruption? All right, Stan, thank you. All right, folks. Sharing is caring. Please share the Alter Rebbe's teachings with others. I'm Rabbi Ronnie Fine coming to you from Chabad Disencumber in Montreal, Canada. It's a privilege and a pleasure to share with you the Tanya. Have a wonderful day.